Welcome to the final event of our fall speaker lineup. We've already had an amazing lineup this semester, and then starting next semester, we've got people in place who are going to be equally amazing. We're going to start with Alan Murray, class of '77. He's CEO of Fortune Media, and he is going to speak to us on January 27th, which is exactly a week after the inauguration of the new president. And we couldn't think of anyone better to help us understand where the country is now and where we'll be going. So please join us at 4 p.m. that day. For today's talk, we're delighted to have Britt Lake, class of 2003, to talk with us about responsible philanthropy. Britt, we're so delighted to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And I didn't make the connection that this is the last, that I'm the last speaker of this little session. I'm feeling really grateful to be able to bring this home. Happy to be here with this community, including a few people from my class who I see here. Hi, friends. I'll be talking about how to give away money, and I'm going to share some my screen here. We'll have a few little interactive polls for you as well. Can everyone see my slide? Yeah, all right, great. What I will say is I'll focus this talk, I'll talk just for about 15 or 20 minutes and then leave some time for questions. But I'll focus it more on sort of how to find the issues and the organizations that speak to you, that are important for you, how to sort of do that research. So not so much like how to set up a family foundation or a DAF or any of the, sort of the tax implications of giving, but really how to find the organizations that speak to you and what's the best way to sort of give those funds away. So we'll start with a poll, and I think that should pop up there. Would love to hear what inspires you to give. So this is just to give me and the community a sense of where you all are. Again, trying to keep this a little engaging and trying to tailor this to what you're interested in. And let me know when you have enough responses in and you want to show the results. Yeah, lots of different reasons that people give, and it might be more than one. I think the poll only allows you to choose one, so go with the one that speaks to you the most. And then are we able to get those results posted or publicly available?
All right, let's see. I'm sharing results now, and so everybody should be able to see them.
A resounding majority of you, opportunity for impact. That's great to hear, and I'll talk a little bit over the next few minutes, the next 15 or so minutes, about ways to sort of assess that impact. If you're just like a regular person trying to give a donation, some resources that you can use. Desire to support a specific location. So that's a really big one for a lot of people, especially this group I know probably feels a strong connection to places like North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as well as places you probably spent some of your Morehead-Cain summers in. So that's a big one, I would guess, for this group as well. Someone you trust ask for a donation. That's actually the #1 reason most people in America give. Someone they trust ask them to give. And they trust that person and want to support what they have. Desire to support a specific location or issue, tax benefits, and other. If you have other, I'd love to hear what that other is if you want to share it in the chat. But really grateful that you guys answered this poll, and really excited to see opportunity for impact as your #1 reason for giving. Hi. I'll try to make this an engaging presentation. Again, we'll use some GIFs, we'll use some polls, a little bit about me. As it was stated before, my name is Britt Lake, I'm class of 2003, and most of my career has been thinking about innovative ways to really be responsible in philanthropy. So was one of the first employees of Global Giving, which is the first and largest global crowdfunding site founded by fellow Morehead-Cain alum, Dennis Whittle. And that site allowed for the first time people to give directly to grassroots organizations around the world in smart and tax deductible ways. Over $500 million has now gone to more than 170 countries through there. I've also spent some time at larger foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I ran a disaster philanthropy hub where we gave about $32 million in very small grassroots grants to local organizations. And then I currently am the CEO of a nonprofit called Feedback Labs, which is really focused on changing the field in philanthropy and official aid and nonprofits to really think more about how do we listen to communities on the ground when we're thinking about how to give and how to execute programs and policies. So that's a little bit about me. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end. And now we'll move into our second poll. Would love to hear from you so I can make sure that we talk about the things that are on your mind. What are your biggest challenges to giving? So some of these on here are some of the common challenges that we hear. People sometimes feel so overwhelmed by need that there's almost paralysis, like if there's too much need, what can I do? Identifying the most effective organizations, not knowing where to give. A challenge might be not feeling like you're able to make a difference with small donations, knowing which organizations are trustworthy. Again, a lot of you said the opportunity for impact is the thing that's driving you. So deciding where you can have the biggest impact is often a challenge. And then even knowing where to look for nonprofit performance information. So if you want to pick the maybe number one for you, and then submit that, and then we'll give it just a few more seconds, and then would love to see where you all are on your biggest challenges. All right. Okay, so it's really a split here. Feeling overwhelmed by need and identifying the most effective organizations are sort of tied there. And we'll try to go through, again, each of these. Hopefully you'll leave in the next few minutes feeling a little bit more prepared to make some of those giving decisions. So how do we make these decisions? Step one, figure out what's important to you. So the first thing that I'll say is that, you know, in a lot of fields, I think Morehead-Cains often always want to know what is the right and the best answer, right? So in things like math or science, you might be able to find a problem and figure out this is absolutely, without a doubt, factually the best thing to do. And with philanthropy, with giving, it's a little bit different, right? So some people might believe that investing a lot, for instance, in education, in one person going deep and being able to provide a well-rounded support has a bigger impact than, for instance, giving small amounts of support to many people. And some people may think the opposite. There's a lot of different ways to think about giving. And as you think about what's important for you, I think the biggest and most important thing is really understanding what is something that you can feel passionate about, that you can feel connected to, and that you can feel that you can make a difference. So that first step is figuring out what's important for you. And there are a number of questions that you can ask yourself. But first want to hear that, and this is the last poll, I promise, what issues you currently care about. Where do you currently give right now? And again, this is just to get a sense of where people are. Some common themes, this is not an exhaustive measure of every type of giving you can do. And I know many of you in your generosity support more than one issue, but would love to hear is it animals, is it arts and culture, disaster relief, education, environment, gender equality. I'm just reading them to give you all time to be able to answer. Human rights, health, religious organizations, social justice. There really are, you know, we mentioned earlier in that first poll, so many different areas that we could invest in our donations. And if those are coming in, maybe we can get a sense of where this group is and what issues they care about, you all care about. Very split. But number one, social justice. Yeah, this year in particular, I think has really shined the light on a lot of social justice issues that A lot of people are feeling passionate about giving to. Religious organizations are up there, education, not surprising with this group, environment, and several others. So thank you all for sharing a little bit about what's passionate for you. Some questions as you try to think about designing your giving. So first, is there an issue that keeps you up at night? So often these are things that you see about in the news or that you read about, but it might just be something in your life that you feel really passionate about. You know, many of you said social justice issues. That's probably very much a reflection of what's going on maybe in your life and in the world and the experiences that you've had. A second question, what local, national, or global causes are you passionate about? So like we said, I said earlier, there's no necessarily right answer. It's not, there's no best way to say giving in Chapel Hill versus giving in India is better than the other. But where is your connection? Where do you feel like your funds can make the most impact? Next, is there an area where you have expertise or you want to learn more? So it might be that you are a doctor and you feel very passionate about healthcare, and that's an area that you feel like you can make smart decisions about giving. Or it could be that you really care about the environment and you want to learn more about what's going on and what people are doing to combat climate change. And so that's an area that you want to be able to learn more about and to donate to. A big one for this group, what opportunities have changed your life and should be available to more people? I think I can speak for all of us that we've all had life-changing opportunities and people investing in us. Are there some of those that you feel connected to and that you want to pay it forward? How much do you want to budget per year for charitable giving? So figuring out at the beginning of the year, looking at your budget, what is your goal for that year? And that might be, again, tied to tax deductibility or tax benefits in your financial planning, or it might just be saying, I know that I want to give a certain percentage of my money back to the communities that have helped me or communities around the world that need support. Is there a population that you care most about supporting? Where can you have the biggest impact? Again, in the way that you define impact. And then finally, given the size of your donation, what size organization do you want to support? So I've talked to a lot of people who say, you know, I want to make sure that my donation goes to a well-established large organization that has proven impact. And I've met other people who really think that it's important for them to support smaller grassroots organizations because they feel like a smaller donation can have a bigger impact there. Again, it's really up to you, but these are decisions that you can make intentionally and think about as you go forward. All right, step 2, do your research. A lot of you talked about sort of wanting to understand what organizations have the biggest impact, what those look like, and thinking about where to find that information. So once you figure out sort of what sort of themes you want to invest in, what size organization, what region, it might be time to start thinking about what organizations to give to. So there are lots of resources online for gathering nonprofit information. For US-based organizations, these are designated by the IRS 501c3 organizations. Again, these are nonprofits that if you give to, you get a tax deduction for. They've been reviewed and identified again by the IRS as charitable organizations. There are a bunch of resources available. So GuideStar by Candid, the website is just up there. That has a record of every 501c3 organization in America. You can go in and search. You can look at their 990s, their tax forms. You can see how they spend their funds, the size of their budget, where they're located. You can also do things like search for all of the nonprofits in Omaha, Nebraska that focus on healthcare. So that's also a good tool to figure out what organizations even exist that are in the areas that you want to give. Charity Navigator is a charity rating organization. Again, they look at and review nonprofits in the US, mostly larger organizations, although they're in the process of sort of revamping their rating scales. But you often may see a nonprofit say, you know, we're a 4-star charity on Charity Navigator. And that means that they've been reviewed by Charity Navigator, and using their rubric, which you can look up and see on their site, they've been identified as a high-performing organization. And then Great Nonprofits is a site that allows recipients of community members that have been supported by a nonprofit, volunteers, staff, other people that have engaged with the nonprofit, to be able to leave reviews, similar to Yelp for a restaurant, but for a nonprofit. So that's a way to see sort of firsthand accounts on people who have interacted with this nonprofit. If you're interested in giving internationally, but you want to know, like, how do I find an organization in Afghanistan? How do I know that that organization is legitimate? And how do I get a tax deduction with that? Global Giving is a great resource there. There's thousands of organizations in more than 170 countries that have all been vetted before they go live on that site. So if you give through a site like that, you know that whether you're giving to Afghanistan or Zimbabwe, that those organizations have been vetted and are equivalent to a US-based 501c3. All right, so you figured out what you want to give to, you figured out where, you looked at all of this research. Next step is selecting the organizations you want to give to. So do definitely use the internet. We've left a lot of resources, you know, we just mentioned a lot of resources, but also using the organization's website, their Facebook, their Twitter, their Instagram, those can sometimes give you more up-to-date information. So it's probably important for you not just to know sort of what did their tax forms look like 2 years ago when they were posted on GuideStar, but really what are they doing now, especially in a year like 2020 that is very fast moving. There's a lot changing. These resources might give you a better sense of how they're adapting, how they're changing. You also can do things like look through their staff page and their board to see what types of, like, who are the people that are carrying out the programs that you're going to be supporting. Don't overburden busy nonprofit staff. So especially this year, when COVID-19 has hit the finances and the programming of so many nonprofits, every nonprofit worker I've talked to has been especially stretched thin this year. So if you're going to give like a $50 donation, maybe don't call up the organization and ask them to have a 1-hour phone call with you about their work, but really start to do some of that research yourself. And then again, finally, I would say don't get tripped up by philanthropy myths. So 2 that I'll mention here. One is the overhead myth, and there's been a lot written about this. And if you Google overhead myth, you can see a letter written by many of the leaders in the philanthropic sector talking about this. But there's often a perception that if an organization spends money on overhead, so things like fundraising or their office or staff, that is a sign of a bad organization. Now think about all of the work that you do. I'm sure some of you, actually, I know some of you looking at the names on the screen work for nonprofits, but even for those of you who don't, think about what it takes to get your own work done, your own organization. It does take staff, it does take offices and lights and all of those things. So, you know, be cognizant of what that sort of percentage looks like, but also don't worry that if any funds are spent on staff or on nonprofit offices or fundraising, that's necessarily a sign of bad financial management. The second is the myth that nonprofit staff should work for free or for very, very low cost. Again, think about the type of issues that you care about and the type of challenges that these nonprofits are trying to solve. You probably want really smart and hardworking people doing that work, right? And so while I'm not necessarily advocating, and many people who talk about this aren't necessarily advocating for staff to be paid millions of dollars, it does take funds and people, and you want smart and capable people to be able to do this work. So those are some factors sort of to think about as you're evaluating nonprofits and the work that they do. And then finally, step 4, trust the organization to make smart decisions. So that means a couple things. One, give in unrestricted ways as much as possible. I think if there's one thing that we've all learned this year, it's that things can change really rapidly, and you need to be able to adapt and pivot quickly in your work. And the same is true for nonprofits. And so if you give funds and say, this absolutely has to be spent in this particular way, and then something like a global pandemic happens and the nonprofit finds that they need to change their strategies or that new things become a priority, you want to have them give them the ability to be able to change in those ways. And then finally, I would say look for organizations that understand the local context. Communities are very difficult things, very complex things. The way that things work in North Carolina might be very different than the way that things work in Burkina Faso, and making sure that you're investing in organizations that have roots in those communities, that are listening to what those communities say will work and will not, is really important to make sure that your donations are being spent in effective ways. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's many ways to support beyond a donation. So you can volunteer. Now during COVID, there are a lot of remote opportunities for volunteering that might look like serving on a board. If you have special skills that a nonprofit might need, like financial skills or legal skills, those are ways that you can really support an organization that might not have the funds to hire their own staff lawyer or their own big financial team. But even in unskilled ways, lots of nonprofits are seeking volunteers. Second, fundraise. If you've spent all this time finding issues that you care about, doing the research, you're likely to be excited about the work that they're doing and passionate to share that. And so feel free to share it with your networks. Nonprofits always love having people who are advocates for the work that they do. And then finally, amplify, following them on social media. If you're on Twitter, retweeting their work, sharing blog posts they've written, and engaging with the material that they share is really important as well. The last thing I'll leave you with is a few resources here on philanthropy. I'm just at the time I wanted to stop and leave for questions, so this is perfect. The first is GiveWell. And so for many of you who are thinking about impact, this is an organization that has looked at trying to tackle that question around what is the best way to give. And I'm not necessarily advocating that this is the answer, but this is one way that a group has tried to solve this answer, to look at dollar for dollar, where can my donation have the biggest impact in terms of lives saved. Center for Effective Philanthropy has a lot of great resources, blog posts, and materials for people who are looking to give. Again, this is mostly focused it's for philanthropic staff, but I think even if you're going to give as an individual, reading some of the work that's happening in this field is really useful. Smart Giving 101, again, this whereas Center for Effective Philanthropy is really focused on more sector-wide giving, Smart Giving 101 is really focused on individual giving. There's some great resources there and materials. And then the last two I'll leave you with is an interesting TED Talk, The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong. It's only about, I think, 15 or 20 minutes might be a good way to round out this talk, to think about some of the issues that I mentioned, some of those philanthropic myths. And then finally, there's a short book, Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva, a UNC grad, which is why I listed it on here, but focusing a lot on philanthropy in general, but also philanthropy in North Carolina. And it might be an interesting read for people who are interested to get into this topic. So that is where I will leave you. Thank you so much. Happy to answer questions that you have. My email address is on here as well, if you have questions that you think of after the fact. But I'll pass it back to Megan if you have questions or if anything has come in.
Great. Happy to have anybody dive in. And Britt, if you will, oh, you've got your screen share up for a reason. I was going to say we can see hands a little bit better if people are waving. It's Hutton. Do you have a question? You're on mute. Hutton, Tiffany, class of 62. I think, Hutton, are you asking your question? It's still muted. Okay. Let's see if I can.
Are you all able to unmute him?
Let me try. I've asked to unmute. Okay, we're trying. Can you?
I could ask a question while you're working on that.
Oh, there we go. I think we've got it, but Chris will grab you right next. Thank you.
One of the 101 things is that you have to recognize your givers in the proper way and thank them.
Mm-hmm.
What do you find the correlation of falling short of some charities and their failure to have a strategic and robust plan to say thank you and recognize?
Yeah, that is actually a very insightful comment, because there's been a lot of research done in the nonprofit sector around this topic. And actually the #1 reason that donors fail to give after their first donation is because they weren't thanked and they didn't feel like they knew where their donation went. And so I don't know the percentage of organizations, of nonprofits, that don't have a robust plan to thank their donors, but I can say that that is, with all of the sector research done, shown to be the #1 reason that donors don't give.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, you're up. Thank you.
Yeah, my question was, I think in reaction to what you were saying earlier, Britt, that many donors give because they're asked to by other people, and I'm wondering, just if there's general advice or resources maybe for maybe people like me, where I have some resources to give. I don't have Bill Gates resources to give. And so I'd like to be strategic about maximizing what I do so that I can have a kind of a snowball effect that makes other people aware, and they tell 2 friends and they tell 2 friends and so on. So learning how to do that and kind of sort of create those virtuous cycles would be really interesting for me.
Yeah, I would say the first thing that comes to mind there is thinking about setting up your donation as a match. And there's a couple ways you could do that. One is just personally reaching out to your friends and family and saying, hey, I'm going to match, I'm supporting organization X. I'm going to match the first $10,000 that my friends give, or working directly with the organization to have them, to say, I will match the first X amount of dollars that comes in through your network. Often, what motivates donors to give is, again, being asked, but having that sense of urgency, right? And so if it's randomly, March 15th, there's no real reason to give on that day. But if my friend says, I'm really passionate about this organization and I'm going to match your donation on March 15th, then that will motivate me perhaps to give when I wouldn't normally have done that. So again, depending upon if you're thinking about wanting to mobilize your own network or to amplify the work that the organization's own development team is doing, I would say setting it up as a match would be a useful way to sort of create that sense of urgency.
Okay, thank you.
Carrie Abramson has a question for you. Carrie?
Britt, thank you so much. This has been really interesting today. I wanted to ask a little bit about how you see the landscape changing based on this year. I'm involved with several nonprofits pretty deeply, and we've seen giving changing a lot in the way people are giving. And I'm curious if that is a trend that's happening across the country. Is it something that you've seen?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things happened at once. And it's a little bit different when we're talking about institutional giving versus individual giving, but I'll try to address both because I think that they sort of follow the same trends a little bit. And so, what we see, well, the first thing that happened is tax laws changed fairly recently in the last few years about how much you can actually take off. So that changed, I believe that was 2 years ago. So that a little bit changed last year how people gave, but it only showed up in this past year, actually showed up in people's tax returns. And so the first year that the change happened, not a lot of people might not have noticed, especially if they weren't giving in huge amounts before. And so this past year, that change actually showed up in terms of tax deduction. And so there was a prediction that would change how giving, individual giving occurred in 2020. However, the CARES Act, which Congress passed, many of you know about, increased again the amount of donations that could be tax deductible because of COVID. And so then there's a hope that individual giving will respond to that increase in tax deduction. So that's sort of the simplistic wonky version of that, of how sort of laws can affect giving. In terms of issues, what we've seen is that as big social events happen in the country, giving is reflected in certain ways. So we saw, several years ago after the election, big swings in donations to different types of organizations that hadn't received that type of giving before. We've seen, for instance, after mass shootings, organizations that work in gun regulations to get big donations. So a lot of what happens in terms of giving happens when when the Haiti earthquake happened, when there's a big disaster that gets a lot of attention, donations flow in that way. And so what we've seen this year are two major things, right? One is a global pandemic, and the second is a sort of reinvigorated movement around social and racial justice. And so a lot of organizations focused on those two issues have gotten more attention than they haven't in the past. However, at the same time, a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of foundations have their endowments have dropped. And so what we've seen is that overall, in general, the nonprofit sector donations have sort of retracted a little bit. And so again and again, I'm talking to nonprofits that have had to lay off staff, that have had to make tough choices at the same time as they're having to deal with increased demand for their services. On the sort of institutional giving side, particularly with foundations, I think there's been an interesting trend happening that I've been excited to see, that has been more focused on giving unrestricted funding, to giving general operating support, to trusting organizations to be able to make the decisions on the ground that they need in real time and quickly without having to sort of rewrite their grant proposals. The Council on Foundations, which is a group that works with foundations, put out a giving pledge very early on, I believe in March, that laid out 8 commitments that foundations are making in light of COVID-19 and how they're giving. That includes things like giving more general operating support, making multi-year commitments, listening and acting on feedback. And close to 800 foundations have now signed on to that. And so that, I think, has opened up a lot of interesting conversations in terms of giving in the institutional space around how the sector gives, how they listen to constituents on the ground. And hopefully that will be something that will sort of carry over and not sort of like stop at the end of this year. So I hope that answered your question.
Great. Ken Smith also was admiring the links in your presentation. We would be happy to post either the presentation or just the pertinent slides on the MCN with your video after this is over. If you give us your permission, we'd love to do that.
I'm happy to send those to you.
Awesome, great.
So is this a time for another question or not?
It is. You're welcome to ask away, Hutton.
Assume for the moment that I'm a potential large giver to a not-for-profit, and my desire is to give enough money to build a building and name it after some worthy individual. Not-for-profit is in dire need of operating money and doesn't need any capital. How do you go to that person and get them to rethink their giving motivation?
Yeah, interesting question. And that's a situation that a lot of people really do face in nonprofits, because again, when I talk about this need for unrestricted funding or general operating support, what we often find is that people do want to give in very particular ways, often in ways that the nonprofit doesn't necessarily need. If I were advising this nonprofit in how to engage with this donor, I would ask them to sort of figure out two things. So one, how do you engage with the donor to talk about where the needs lie, and trying to figure out for that particular person, what is sort of the argument that makes sense for them. So for some people, it might be really digging deep into the financials. It might be going through the budget and saying, this is where we have funding for, and this is where our gaps are. For others, it might be an emotional appeal and really telling the stories about what funding in different sort of directed in different ways could have. So that's one part of it. The second, I would advise them to understand what is motivating that donor, and how do you meet that motivation, meet that need for the donor without, even if you don't do the building. So for instance, what that donor's motivation might be is creating a lasting memory or a lasting memorial to someone that they love. So is there a way to do that without building a building? Is there a way to get them that memorial or that attention, or give them the feeling, the lasting legacy that they want to create without doing the building? And then if that donor, if that's what they want to do regardless, it's up to the nonprofit to say, to ask themselves, is it worth it to accept this donation, or is it something that will actually not be beneficial overall to the organization? Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Great. Good question.
Britt, James Barnes has a question for you.
Great. Thanks, Britt, for great talk. Question is about intergenerational conversations around giving. And I'm wondering if you have noticed or got any evidence to see more intergenerational conversations around giving during these COVID times when we are all online. I guess my hypothesis is I'm talking more with my children and our children and grandchildren just because we're able to online. And I'm wondering if, there's anything that you're seeing from within the industry.
I haven't seen anything specifically about that, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. One of the things that I've seen in general over the last few years, not specific to COVID, is creative ways that nonprofits have used the internet and social media to have those different types of conversations. There's been some books in the past, not recent this year, but recent in the last few years, about how to talk to your children about it. So for instance, one of the things that we worked on when I was at Global Giving is we had gift cards that you could give to, it didn't have to be a child, it could be an adult as well. But often around the holidays, a lot of people gave to their children or their grandchildren these, $25 gift cards that they then could go onto the website, look at 5,000 different projects around the world, and have that conversation about basically what we just went through, like what issues are important for you, what regions you want to invest in, and start to open up that conversation. I had a few years ago gave one to my niece and was really very impressed when I think she was 6 at the time, and she went through a very long sort of like self-reflective period where she was trying to understand, she was like, well, animals are very cute, but how could I give to animals over a child that's hungry? And it was really, when I went through that experience with her specifically, it was a really enlightening way to sort of have those conversations. So I think, I don't know COVID specific if that has changed that, but have been seeing over the last few years creative ways that families have started to have those conversations.
Great, thanks.
Britt, Peter McCullough, class of 86, has a question for you. He asks, is there a way to give, say, $10K to an organization anonymously so they don't spend dollars recruiting more from you? I suppose one could hire a lawyer or create an LLC, but is there a simpler service?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization and how they accept their donations. So, and I'm assuming, well, if you want a tax deduction, you probably need a tax receipt. So you'd have to give them your name and address. But there are often, especially with larger donations, ways to talk to the organization to say, I want to make this donation anonymously. So that they don't do that. So I don't have a great answer for there because it really does depend organization by organization. For instance, in Global Giving, because we were then passing on the donation to the organization, there was a box that you could check to say anonymous. So we actually just didn't even pass on the donor contact information beyond, we passed on the donation, gave them the tax receipt, but didn't pass on the donation to the actual donor information to the actual donor giving organization, apologies. So yeah, it really depends. I would say for larger organizations, for larger amounts of donations, you can talk to the organization about how you want to do that.
I think James Barnes can add a little bit to that.
Great.
Sure. I was lucky enough to spend 12 years with Vanguard Charitable Donor Advice Fund. So that would not be who you would go to for this because their minimum account is $25,000, but both Schwab Charitable and Fidelity Charitable's minimum gift is $5,000. And you can make an anonymous gift from a donor advice fund. So with this scenario, $10,000, you can open an account at Fidelity or Schwab Charitable, make your anonymous gift. It costs you nothing. It's super easy. It's all online. And that's my answer anyway.
Yeah, great point. Thanks. I wasn't even thinking about DAFs. Great idea.
Okay, and Noel Donovan has a question for you in the chat. It is, I've read that it's quote unquote better to give more to fewer organizations than less to more organizations. Do you have a perspective / recommendation regarding whether to allocate to more or fewer orgs?
That goes back to that initial comment I made about how, like what your own personal giving is. I personally think it is better to give to more to fewer organizations because it is really important for organizations, especially in a lasting way, for organizations to have more stable income going forward. So for instance, knowing that you can make a monthly recurring donation to an organization is really, really powerful because it allows the organization to plan a little bit better for what their future finances look like. Versus, having an unpredictable stream of income. I don't have any great.
The giver gets less mail.
I'm sorry?
Less mail.
Less mail. True.
By giving to only a few.
Exactly. Good point. Saving the environment with less mail too. And yeah, I think a similar question here, is it better to give a regular annual monthly donation so the organization knows what their income is going to be? Again, I would say yes, just because again, that predictability of income is really, really important. We did, in Global Giving, we did some surveying of our organizations, and they actually preferred slightly, not a lot, but slightly less money in a predictable way than more money in a one-time way that they wouldn't know if it was ever coming again. Because again, it allowed them to make long-term decisions that were important for them to achieve their mission, like hiring staff or investing in longer-term projects. All right.
And any advice on using gifts of stock?
Yeah, no real advice. I mean, most nonprofits do, they usually have a policy on how they accept stock, and usually it's that they sell it off relatively quickly and turn it into cash. And so for you, I mean, it would depend on where things are, but if knowing that they're going to sell it off soon after they receive it, that might affect the timing of when you give it.
Mm-hmm.
Britt, may I ask a question?
Sure.
You may have noticed that octogenarians are more inclined to flap their gums at that age than they are when they are younger men. So I have one more question.
Perfect.
In these larger national not-for-profits, or even smaller, how are they regulated other than the 990s of the IRS? Are they self-regulated, or is there a industry regulation, or is there any government regulation of any kind?
Yeah, so there's the general, IRS guidelines for 501c3 that applies for all of them. But like you're saying, that's not very, that still leaves a lot of leeway for organizations. So some of the resources that I listed, like Charity Navigator, is an organization that looks deeper into some of these organizations, into their finances and into their operations. I would also say their board, the board of directors, serves as a sort of regulatory board for the organization, looking at their finances and other things. But like you're saying, a lot of nonprofits do have a lot of leeway, and we have seen that some nonprofits, particularly those that are coming from outside a country into a new place, often are given a lot of power that isn't checked besides within the own organization. But I would say the main two are groups like GuideStar and Charity Navigator, as well as the nonprofit's own board should be playing that role.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks for the questions.
Peter has another question. He says, maybe all of us have retirement accounts vulnerable to market forces and black swan events. If we give in our will, that kind of ensures against ending up in the poorhouse because you gave away all your wealth. But on the other hand, it would be nice to be alive to see the good deeds of your charity. There might be some financial mechanism that bridges these needs. Is it an annuity managed by the organization?
I don't know if James has a good answer to that one. Not to call on someone in the audience.
Yeah, no, I don't have a good answer to it, except that I do think gift annuities are a massively overlooked possibility. So if you take the example of somebody with a, I don't know, a $2 million house and a $2 million dollar, investments in, I don't know, government securities, and they're living on their own and they're sad and they're coming to the end of their life, what they're short of is income, because particularly in today's interest rate environment. So they got $4 million. They could give that away to the charity of their choice. Well, the Morehead-Cains, for example, have a gift annuity, yielding quite a nice return. And the risk they would have would be the entity, the Morehead-Cains, which is a solid risk, in my opinion. So I think there are various ways annuities can work. They're also sometimes relatively expensive to do in terms of fees, but they can be perfect for people. I'm trying to remember the name of a group. Anyway, there's one group I would point people to that is down in Florida, is really good to sort of give advice on that. So I'll leave it there.
James, we'll pick your brain on that later and put it with the slideshow, the video, and any other nice tips that people have coming out of this. Fantastic. Other questions for Britt? An amazing lineup. I was going to say we're excited because Give Well, we have a Morehead-Cain alum working there, so they're everywhere. You all are everywhere, and thanks to everybody on the call who's given to Morehead-Cain this week. As you know, we're having our day of giving on Friday, and already we are tracking well ahead of last year. So we're super excited to give you all the results when all of that is said and done. So good. Well, if no more questions, I just have to say, wow, thank you, Britt. I know we all learned a ton, and just appreciate so much helping us figure out how to give in a way that really means the most to all of us. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all for staying this whole time and for all the great questions.